I defended a mute child from bullies on the playground and didn't think twice about it until 6 men in suits surrounded me, and the most dangerous man in the city knelt beside his son. Now he says I'm the only person his boy has ever trusted, and he's not letting me walk away. But am I becoming part of their family or just another piece in his deadly game? The playground smelled like wet asphalt and broken promises, the kind of place where childhood ended too early for kids who had nothing except the clothes on their backs, and dreams too big for the neighborhood that tried to crush them. Debbie Morrison stood at the edge of the chain-link fence, her worn sneakers planted in a puddle she couldn't afford to care about anymore, watching a scene that made her blood run cold. 3 boys, maybe 12 years old, had cornered someone smaller against the brick wall of Riverside Elementary, their fists already raised, their voices carrying the kind of cruelty that kids learn from watching the world chew up everyone around them. Debbie's first instinct was to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen anything, to walk back to her classroom where 23 other fifth graders were waiting for her to explain fractions like math mattered, when half of them went home to empty refrigerators. She was tired, bone-deep exhausted from working 2 jobs just to afford the studio apartment in the rough part of Bridgeport where gunshots were as common as car alarms. She was 28 years old and felt twice that, carrying student loan debt that would probably outlive her, and dreams of making a difference that died a little more each day. But then the small figure against the wall turned his head, and Debbie saw his face. He couldn't have been more than 9, with dark hair that fell across terrified eyes, and clothes that probably cost more than Debbie made in 3 months. Designer jacket, expensive shoes that were about to get scuffed beyond repair, and a watch on his wrist that glinted even in the gray afternoon light. He didn't belong here. Didn't belong in this school where the metal detectors at the front door were the newest equipment they had, and the textbooks were older than most of the teachers. The boy's mouth was moving, trying to say something, but no sound came out. His hands moved frantically in the air, forming shapes and gestures that Debbie recognized immediately because she'd spent her college summers working at a camp for kids with special needs. He was signing, desperately trying to communicate with his attackers who either didn't understand or didn't care. "Please don't," his hand said. "I didn't do anything wrong." One of the bullies shoved him harder against the wall. "What's wrong, rich boy? Cat got your tongue?" The other 2 laughed. That harsh sound that kids make when they're trying to prove they're tougher than they feel inside. "Your daddy's not here to protect you now." Debbie was moving before she made the conscious decision to intervene. Her legs carried her across the cracked pavement of the playground, her voice finding strength she didn't know she still had. "Step away from him. Right now." The 3 boys turned, surprise flashing across their faces before it hardened into defiance. The tallest one, a kid named Derek who'd been in and out of the principal's office more times than Debbie could count, sneered at her. "This ain't your business, Miss Morrison. Rich kid needs to learn he can't just walk into our school like he owns the place." "I said step away," Debbie repeated, putting herself between the bullies and their victim. She was aware of how small she looked, how her secondhand cardigan and faded jeans marked her as someone without power or influence. But she'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the only thing standing between a kid and disaster was someone willing to stand at all. Derek took a step forward, trying to intimidate her. Debbie didn't move. Behind her, she could feel the small boy trembling, could sense his fear radiating like heat. "You're making a mistake," Derek said, his voice carrying a warning that made Debbie's stomach clench. "You know who this kid is? You know who his father is?" "I know he's a child who deserves to get through one day without being terrorized," Debbie shot back. "Now, unless you want to spend the next week in detention, I suggest you walk away." For a moment, she thought Derek might actually swing at her. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Then one of his friends grabbed his arm, whispering something urgent that Debbie couldn't hear. Whatever it was made Derek's face go pale. He looked past Debbie at the boy behind her, then back at Debbie, with something that looked almost like fear. "You don't know what you're doing, Miss Morrison," Derek said, backing away. "You really don't." The three bullies scattered across the playground like roaches when the lights come on, leaving Debbie alone with the small boy who was still pressed against the wall. Debbie turned around slowly, keeping her movements gentle and non-threatening. The boy was watching her with eyes that were too old for his face, too knowing for someone who should still believe the world was basically good. Up close, she could see the bruise forming on his cheekbone, the scrape on his hand where he'd tried to defend himself. "Hi there," Debbie said softly, then lifted her hands and signed. "Are you hurt? Do you need to see the nurse?" The transformation was instant and heartbreaking. The boy's entire face lit up like someone had just told him he mattered, like someone had finally seen him as more than a problem or a target or a symbol of everything wrong with the world. His hands flew into motion, signing so fast that Debbie had to ask him to slow down. "My name is Ben," he signed, tears welling up in his eyes. "You know how to talk to me?" "Yes, I know sign language," Debbie signed back, her own throat tightening with emotion. "I'm Miss Morrison. I teach 5th grade here. What are you doing at Riverside Elementary? This isn't your usual school, is it?" Ben's hands moved carefully now, forming words that made Debbie's blood run cold. "My regular school expelled me. They said I was too difficult, too much trouble because I can't talk. My father enrolled me here yesterday. He said if I could survive here for 1 semester, I'd learn what real life was like." Debbie discovered Ben was okay after the attack and learned that nobody ever helped him. But their moment was interrupted when 6 men in dark suits appeared with a 7th man, tall, powerful, and clearly dangerous, who turned out to be Ben's father, Dimitri Volkov. Dimitri examined Ben's bruise with careful fury and demanded to know who attacked his son, his rage intensifying as Ben signed the story and pointed to Debbie as his rescuer, prompting Dimitri to clear the entire playground with a single quiet command. When Dimitri ordered his men to get the names and addresses of Ben's attackers so he could have conversations with their parents, Debbie courageously stepped forward to defend the boys, arguing they were just stupid kids, and that violence wasn't the answer, which seemed to intrigue Dimitri even as he explained that Ben would never truly be safe in a world where people treated him as either a target or an inconvenience because he couldn't speak. Something in Dimitri's voice, something raw and painful, made Debbie's anger soften into something else. This was a father who loved his son desperately, who would burn the world down to keep him safe. She understood that kind of love. She'd felt it for her younger brother before the overdose took him, before she learned that sometimes love isn't enough to save the people who matter most. "I don't know what that's like," Debbie admitted. "But I know your son deserves better than to grow up watching his father solve every problem with fear and violence. He deserves to see that there are other ways to be strong." The playground fell silent. One of Dimitri's men shifted uncomfortably, and Debbie realized she might have just crossed a line that people didn't usually survive crossing. But Dimitri didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful, studying Debbie like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, Miss Morrison," he said finally. "I haven't decided which yet." Ben tugged on his father's sleeve, his hands moving quickly. Debbie watched Dimitri's face as he followed his son's words, and she was struck by how gentle his expression became when he looked at the boy. "What's he saying?" Debbie asked softly. Dimitri's jaw tightened. "He's telling me that you're the first teacher who ever stood up for him, the first person in his entire life, besides me, who treated him like he was worth protecting." The words hung in the air like a confession. Debbie felt pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. The expensive clothes, the bodyguards, the fear in Derek's eyes when he realized who Ben's father was. The way everyone avoided looking at Ben, afraid of drawing attention from the dangerous man who controlled his life. Mr. Volkov, Debbie said carefully, what you do for a living is none of my business. But your son is a student at this school now, which makes him my business. He deserves to have at least one place where he can just be a normal kid. Dimitri laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Normal? My son will never be normal, Miss Morrison. He can't speak, his mother is dead, and his father is a man the entire city fears. Normal isn't an option for Ben. Then let him at least be safe, Debbie pressed. Let him come to school without his bodyguards hovering around him. Let him make friends, make mistakes. Just be a kid for a few hours a day. Absolutely not. Dimitri's voice turned cold again. You saw what happened today. The moment I'm not watching, someone tries to hurt him. That happened because those boys know who you are, Debbie said, finding courage she didn't know she had. They wanted to prove they weren't afraid of the big bad Volkov. But if you back off, if you let Ben just be another student here, maybe things could be different. Dimitri studied her for a long moment, then turned to Ben. His hands moved in sign language, asking his son something Debbie couldn't quite follow. Ben's response was immediate and emphatic, his small hands forming words with desperate hope. When he finished, Dimitri closed his eyes like he was in pain. My son says he wants to try it your way, Dimitri said finally, opening his eyes to look at Debbie with an expression that was equal parts resignation and threat. He says he trusts you to keep him safe. Debbie felt the weight of that trust settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. I'll do my best. Your best had better be enough, Dimitri said quietly, because if anything happens to my son while he's in your care, Miss Morrison, there won't be anywhere in this city you can hide from me. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. The card was heavy, expensive paper with just a name and a phone number embossed in silver. That's my private line. If Ben needs anything, if there's any trouble at all, you call me immediately. Understood? Debbie took the card, her fingers trembling slightly. Understood. Dimitri knelt down again, pulling Ben into a tight embrace that lasted longer than Debbie expected. When he finally let go, he signed something to his son that made the boy nod seriously. Then Dimitri stood up and looked at Debbie one more time. I'm trusting you with the only thing in this world that matters to me, Miss Morrison. Don't make me regret it. As Dimitri and his men left the playground, Debbie stood there with Ben's hand in hers once again, watching the black cars drive away. She'd just made a promise she had no idea how to keep to a man who could destroy her life with a single phone call. But when she looked down at Ben's hopeful face, she knew she'd made the right choice. Sometimes the most dangerous decisions were the only ones worth making. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Debbie had transformed her classroom into something she'd never imagined it could be. Ben sat in the front row, his notebook open, his eyes bright with the kind of engagement she rarely saw in her other students. She'd spent the first week teaching the entire class basic sign language, turning it into a game that had the kids competing to see who could learn the most signs. To her surprise, they'd embraced it enthusiastically, proud of their new secret language. Derek, the bully from the playground, now sat 2 rows behind Ben and knew how to sign "I'm sorry" in 12 different ways. But it was after school that the real magic happened. Debbie had started staying late 3 days a week, giving Ben private lessons that went far beyond the standard curriculum. She taught him about literature and science, about art and music, about all the things a 9-year-old should be learning when he wasn't busy trying to survive in a world that saw him as either a liability or a trophy. More importantly, she taught him how to express emotions he'd never been allowed to feel. Frustration, joy, anger, hope, all the messy, complicated feelings that made someone human. Today we're going to talk about what you want to be when you grow up. Debbie signed as they sat in the empty classroom, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. I don't know, Ben signed back, his small face scrunching in concentration. My father says I'll take over his business someday. But what do you want? Debbie pressed. Not what your father wants, not what anyone else thinks you should do. What makes you happy? Ben's hands were still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he signed. I like animals. I want to help them. Maybe be a veterinarian. Debbie felt her heart swell. Then that's what you should work toward. We'll start learning about animals, about what it takes to become a vet. Your father wants you to be happy, Ben. He'll understand. Ben's expression turned doubtful. My father wants me to be strong. He says the world is dangerous and I need to learn how to survive in it. You can be both strong and kind, Debbie signed back. You can survive and still choose to help others. That's what real strength looks like. They were interrupted by a soft knock on the classroom door. Debbie looked up to find Dimitri standing in the doorway, looking oddly out of place in his expensive suit surrounded by finger paintings and alphabet charts. Mr. Volkov, Debbie said, standing up quickly. Is everything okay? I came to see how my son was doing, Dimitri said, his accent making the simple words sound formal. I hope I'm not interrupting? Not at all. Debbie gestured to the chair beside Ben's desk. Please, come in. Dimitri moved into the classroom with the same predatory grace Debbie had noticed on the playground, but something was different now. He looked less threatening somehow, more human. When he saw Ben's face light up, saw the obvious joy in his son's eyes, something shifted in his expression. Papa, Ben signed, launching into an excited explanation of everything he'd learned that day. Debbie watched Dimitri's face as he followed his son's words, and she was struck by how his entire demeanor changed. The hard lines around his mouth softened. His gray eyes warmed from winter storm to something closer to spring sky. You've been teaching him more than just schoolwork, Dimitri observed, his gaze shifting to Debbie. He's different, happier. I'm teaching him to be himself, Debbie said simply, to not apologize for existing, to not hide who he is just because the world is uncomfortable with silence. Dimitri was quiet for a long moment, studying her with that intense focus that still made Debbie's pulse quicken. Miss Morrison, may I speak with you privately for a moment? Debbie glanced at Ben, who nodded and signed that he'd be fine drawing pictures while they talked. She followed Dimitri into the hallway, acutely aware of how small the space felt with his presence filling it. I need to ask you something, Dimitri said, his voice low, and I need you to be honest with me. Okay, Debbie said warily. Why are you doing this? The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? You're a teacher at an underfunded public school, Dimitri said bluntly. You make barely enough to survive. You work 2 jobs just to keep a roof over your head. Yet you stay late 3 times a week to give my son private lessons. You've reorganized your entire classroom around his needs, and you defend him against bullies who could make your life here miserable. He stepped closer, and Debbie caught a whiff of expensive cologne. So I ask again, why are you doing this? Debbie met his eyes, refusing to be intimidated. Because he deserves it. Because every child deserves to have at least one person who believes in them. Because I'm a teacher, Mr. Volkov, and that's what teachers do. Most teachers give up on difficult students, Dimitri countered. Most people see my son and decide he's too much work, too much trouble. Then most people are idiots, Debbie said bluntly. Ben is brilliant. He's creative and funny and surprisingly wise for a 9-year-old. The fact that he can't speak doesn't change any of that. It just means the rest of us have to work a little harder to understand him. Dimitri's expression did something Debbie had never seen before. His mask cracked, revealing raw emotion underneath. Do you have any idea how rare that is? To find someone who sees him as more than his disability or his last name? Debbie felt her throat tighten. I'm sorry that's rare, Mr. Volkov, but it shouldn't be. For a moment they just stood there in the hallway, the space between them charged with something Debbie didn't want to examine too closely. Then Dimitri reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you." Debbie looked at the envelope suspiciously. "What is it?" "Open it." She did, and her heart nearly stopped. Inside was a check for an amount that would cover her student loans, her rent for a year, and probably let her buy a car that didn't make concerning noises every time she started it. "I can't accept this," Debbie said immediately, trying to hand it back. "You can and you will," Dimitri said firmly. "Consider it payment for the private lessons you've been giving my son." "I'm not doing this for money," Debbie protested. "I know," Dimitri said, and his voice carried a warmth she hadn't heard before. "That's exactly why you deserve it. You're giving my son something I can't buy, Miss Morrison. Hope. A future where he's more than just Dimitri Volkov's son. That's priceless." Debbie stared at the check, torn between pride and practicality. The money would change her life, would let her focus on teaching instead of scrambling to survive. But accepting it felt like crossing a line, like becoming obligated to this dangerous man in ways she couldn't predict. "Please," Dimitri said softly. "Let me do this one thing. Let me show my gratitude the only way I know how." Debbie looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw past the expensive suit and the dangerous reputation to the father underneath. A man who loved his son so desperately that he was willing to trust a stranger to give that son the childhood he deserved. "Okay," she whispered. "But only if you promise to stop sending bodyguards to watch the school. It's making the other kids nervous and it's not helping Ben fit in." Dimitri's smile was genuine this time, transforming his entire face. "Deal." As they walked back into the classroom, Debbie realized something that should have terrified her, but somehow didn't. She wasn't just Ben's teacher anymore. She was becoming part of something bigger, something more complicated, something that connected her to Dimitri Volkov in ways that went beyond the simple transaction of education. And she had no idea if that was the best decision she'd ever made or the worst mistake of her life. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, shattering Debbie's sleep with the kind of urgency that made her heart race before she was even fully awake. Dimitri's voice on the other end was tight with barely controlled fury. "I need you at Mercy Hospital. Now. Ben's been hurt." Debbie was out of bed and dressed in under 3 minutes, her hands shaking as she drove through empty streets toward the hospital. She didn't let herself think about what hurt meant, didn't let herself imagine all the terrible possibilities. She just drove, pushing her barely functioning car to speeds it probably couldn't handle, praying she'd get there in time. The hospital's emergency room was chaos. Nurses rushed between rooms. Machines beeped urgently, and somewhere, a child was crying. But Debbie's eyes found Dimitri immediately, standing outside a closed door with his hands clenched into fists and his face carved from stone. Blood stained his white shirt, and she realized with horror that it probably wasn't his. "What happened?" Debbie demanded, reaching him. "Where's Ben? Is he okay?" Dimitri's gray eyes were haunted when he looked at her. "There was an accident. Someone tried to run us off the road on the way home from dinner. Our car flipped. Ben hit his head." The words felt like punches. "Oh God, is he—" "He's alive," Dimitri cut her off, conscious. "But he's terrified and he won't let anyone touch him except me. The doctors need to run tests. Need to make sure there's no internal bleeding. But he's fighting them." Dimitri's voice cracked slightly. "He keeps signing your name, Debbie, over and over. You're the only other person he trusts." Debbie didn't hesitate. "Take me to him." The room Ben was in looked like a war zone. 2 nurses stood near the door, looking frustrated and helpless. Medical equipment beeped urgently, and in the middle of it all was Ben, his small body pressed into the corner of the hospital bed, his hands moving frantically in sign language that no one else in the room understood. His face was bruised, his arm in a temporary splint, and he had a cut above his eye that made Debbie's heart break. "Ben," she signed, moving slowly into his line of sight. "It's Miss Morrison. I'm here." The transformation was instant. Ben's terrified expression shifted to desperate relief as he reached out for her with his good arm. Debbie moved to the bed, gently taking his hand and sitting beside him. "You're safe now," she signed with her free hand. "Your father is here. I'm here. We're not going to let anything else hurt you." "I was so scared." Ben signed back, tears streaming down his face. "The car flipped and everything went dark, and I thought I was going to die like Mom did." Debbie's throat closed with emotion. She looked at Dimitri, who was watching from the doorway with an expression that looked like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed. "Can I tell the doctors it's okay to examine him?" Debbie asked Ben gently. "I promise I'll stay right here holding your hand the whole time. Your father will be here too. We won't leave you." Ben nodded slowly, his trust in her absolute and heartbreaking. For the next hour, Debbie sat beside Ben as doctors examined him, running tests and taking x-rays while she signed constant reassurance. Dimitri stood on the other side of the bed, his large hand resting gently on his son's leg, his expression tight with worry. Finally, the lead doctor emerged with news. "He's going to be okay. Mild concussion, sprained arm, lots of bruises, but nothing permanent. He's incredibly lucky." Dimitri's knees actually buckled slightly with relief. Debbie watched as he leaned against the wall, his carefully maintained control finally cracking. "Thank you," he said to the doctor, his voice rough. "When can he go home?" "We'd like to keep him overnight for observation, given the head injury, but if all goes well, tomorrow afternoon." After the doctors left, Debbie stayed with Ben until he fell asleep, her hand still in his. Only then did she allow herself to look at Dimitri, really look at him. He'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. His expensive suit was ruined, his hair disheveled, and his gray eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and unshed tears. "This wasn't an accident, was it?" Debbie asked quietly. Dimitri's expression turned cold. "No. It was a message from a rival who thinks I've gotten soft, who thinks Ben makes me vulnerable." "Does he?" Dimitri looked at his sleeping son, and Debbie saw something in his face that made her chest ache. "Yes. Having something you love more than your own life makes you vulnerable in ways you can't imagine, Miss Morrison. It gives your enemies a target. It means every decision you make, every risk you take, could hurt the one person you're trying to protect." "So what are you going to do?" Debbie asked, already knowing the answer and dreading it. "What I have to do," Dimitri said, his voice like steel. "I'm going to make sure the people responsible for this understand that touching my son was the last mistake they'll ever make." Debbie stood up carefully, not wanting to wake Ben. She moved to where Dimitri stood, close enough to see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the barely controlled rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. "And then what? You kill them, their families come after you. You kill them? The cycle never ends. When does it stop, Mr. Volkov? When does Ben get to just be a kid instead of a weapon someone uses against you?" Dimitri's eyes blazed. "Don't presume to lecture me about my world, Miss Morrison. You don't understand what it takes to survive in it." "You're right, I don't understand," Debbie said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "But I understand that Ben is lying in a hospital bed because of choices you've made, because of enemies you've created. And if you really love him, if you really want what's best for him, maybe it's time to consider whether this life is worth it." The silence that followed was deafening. Dimitri stared at her with an expression Debbie couldn't read, fury and pain and something else all mixed together. "You think I haven't thought about that?" he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think I don't lie awake every night wondering if Ben would be better off without me? If he'd be safer with someone normal, someone who doesn't have blood on their hands and enemies waiting in every shadow. Then why don't you change? Debbie challenged. Why don't you walk away from all of this? Because it's not that simple, Dimitri said, his accent thickening with emotion. My family, my business, it's not something you just leave. And even if I could, even if I walked away tomorrow, my enemies would still exist. Ben would still be a target. The only difference is, I wouldn't have the resources to protect him. Debbie understood the trap he was describing, the impossible position of being so deep in a dangerous world that there was no way out. But she also saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine love he had for his son, and she made a decision that probably made her as reckless as everyone said she was. Then let me help, she said. Not with your business, not with whatever war you're fighting, but let me help you give Ben something normal, something good, a reason to believe his life can be more than just survival. Dimitri studied her face for a long moment. Why would you do that? Why would you involve yourself deeper in something this dangerous? Debbie thought about her brother, about the promises she'd made to herself after he died, about how she'd sworn she'd never stand by and watch someone suffer if there was something, anything, she could do to help. Because that little boy in there deserves better than the hand life dealt him. And because you're trying to be a good father in an impossible situation. I can't fix your world, Mr. Volkov, but maybe I can help make Ben's a little bit brighter. Something shifted in Dimitri's expression then, something Debbie had never seen before. The mask fell away completely, leaving only the man underneath. Vulnerable, exhausted, desperate for someone to understand. Debbie, he said, using her first name for the first time. If you do this, if you really commit to being part of Ben's life, there's no going back. You'll always be connected to me, to my world. People will use you to get to me. You'll become a target. I became a target the moment I stood between your son and those bullies, Debbie said softly. I just didn't realize it yet. Dimitri reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently took her hand. His grip was warm, solid, and surprisingly gentle for someone who probably had more blood on his hands than Debbie wanted to think about. Then welcome to the family, Debbie Morrison. God help us all. 3 months after the accident, Debbie's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Her tiny apartment was gone, replaced by a small house in a better neighborhood that Dimitri had insisted on buying for her, despite her protests. Her student loans were paid off. Her car actually started every morning. But more importantly, Ben had become a permanent fixture in her life, spending 3 afternoons a week at her house doing homework, playing games, and just being a normal kid. She'd learned to navigate the strange new world she'd stumbled into, the world where bodyguards followed her to the grocery store and expensive gifts appeared on her doorstep with notes in Dimitri's precise handwriting. She'd learned which questions not to ask, which conversations to pretend she hadn't overheard, which parts of Dimitri's life she was better off not knowing about. But she'd also seen another side of him, the father who read bedtime stories to his son in sign language, who knew every constellation in the night sky because Ben loved astronomy, who cried quietly in the kitchen when he thought no one was looking because he was so grateful his son was alive. Miss Morrison, Ben signed one afternoon as they worked on a science project at her kitchen table. Can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. What is it? Ben's hands moved carefully, forming words that clearly made him nervous. Do you like my father? Debbie felt her heart skip. She'd been very careful not to let her personal feelings show, but apparently she hadn't been as subtle as she thought. Your father is a good man who loves you very much, Debbie signed carefully. Why do you ask? Because he's different when you're around, Ben signed, his young face serious. He smiles more. He doesn't look so tired. And sometimes I catch him watching you when you're helping me with homework. and his face gets all soft like when he used to look at Mom. Debbie's breath caught in her throat. She'd noticed it too. The way Dimitri's eyes followed her movements. The way his voice gentled when he spoke to her. The way he found excuses to stay longer when he picked Ben up from her house. She'd told herself it meant nothing, that she was just the woman helping his son, that any warmth between them was just gratitude. But Ben's observation made it harder to deny what had been growing between them for months. "Your father and I are friends," Debbie signed, choosing her words carefully. "We both care about you very much, and that brings us together." "But could you be more than friends?" Ben pressed, his hands moving with innocent hope. "Could you maybe love each other like Mom and Dad did? Because I think that would be nice. I think Dad is lonely, and you're always alone too, and maybe you could be not alone together." Debbie felt tears prickling at her eyes. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that the world wasn't that simple? That his father lived in a world of violence and danger that she could barely comprehend? That caring about Dimitri Volkov meant accepting parts of him she wasn't sure she could live with? But before she could respond, her front door opened and Dimitri himself walked in, stopping short when he saw them at the kitchen table. "Am I early?" he asked, glancing at his watch. "I thought pickup was at 5. "You're right on time," Debbie said, acutely aware of the flush in her cheeks. "We were just finishing up." Ben looked between the two adults, then deliberately gathered his books with exaggerated slowness, giving them time alone. Debbie would have laughed if she wasn't so nervous about what might happen next. "Debbie," Dimitri said once Ben had wandered into the living room, ostensibly to pack his backpack, but obviously giving them privacy. "I need to talk to you about something." "Okay," Debbie said, her heart hammering. "There's a situation developing," Dimitri said, his voice low and serious. "A rival family making moves, asking questions about my vulnerabilities. My security team believes they've identified you as someone important to me." Debbie felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means I need to increase your protection," Dimitri said. "It means you can't be alone anymore, not until this is resolved. I'm assigning you a bodyguard." "Dimitri, I can't live like that," Debbie protested. "I'm a teacher. How am I supposed to explain to my students why there's a man in a suit following me around?" "You're going to have to find a way," Dimitri said firmly, "because the alternative is you getting hurt, and that's not something I'm willing to risk." "Why?" Debbie demanded, frustration overriding caution. "Why am I so important that you need to protect me? I'm just your son's teacher." Dimitri's gray eyes blazed with something Debbie couldn't quite identify. "You know you're more than that. Don't pretend you don't see what's been happening between us." The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thick to breathe. "Dimitri, I know this is complicated." He cut her off, stepping closer. "I know I'm the last man you should get involved with. But somewhere between you standing up to those bullies and sitting beside my son's hospital bed and making him laugh when I thought he'd forgotten how, I fell in love with you, Debbie Morrison. And I'm done pretending I haven't." The words hung in the air like a confession and a threat all at once. Debbie's mind raced with all the reasons this was a terrible idea, all the ways loving Dimitri Volkov could destroy her life. But her heart? Her stupid, stubborn heart was already speaking before her brain could stop it. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me, I do. But Dimitri, I don't know if I can live in your world. I don't know if I can be with someone who solves problems with violence, who has enemies who might hurt me just to get to him." Dimitri's expression crumbled slightly. "I know. I know what I'm asking is unfair. But Debbie, I swear to you, I will do everything in my power to keep you safe. I will change what I can change, walk away from what I can walk away from. For Ben, yes, but also for you, because you make me want to be better than what I am." Debbie looked past him to where Ben was watching from the living room doorway, his young face bright with hope. She thought about all the reasons to say no, to protect herself, to walk away before this dangerous man pulled her deeper into a world she didn't understand. Then she thought about Ben's laughter, about the way Dimitri's eyes softened when he looked at his son, about the family they could maybe, possibly build together if they were brave enough and lucky enough and strong enough to survive it. "Okay," she said finally, "but I have conditions." Dimitri's expression shifted to cautious hope. "Name them." "First, you be honest with me. Always. I don't need to know every detail of your business, but I need to know when I'm in danger. No more protecting me by keeping me in the dark." "Done," Dimitri agreed. "Second, we do this right. We date, we take it slow, we don't rush into anything. Ben's been through enough trauma. He doesn't need to see us moving too fast and then falling apart." "Agreed." "And third," Debbie took a deep breath, "you start looking for a way out. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. Because I won't watch Ben grow up to inherit your enemies and your violence. If we're going to be a family, we need to build towards something better than what you have now." Dimitri was quiet for a long moment, and Debbie thought maybe she'd pushed too far, asked for too much. Then he reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his touch warm and surprisingly tender. "I'll try," he said simply. "I can't promise I'll succeed. I can't promise it will be easy or quick. But for you and for Ben, I'll try to find a way out of this life." Debbie leaned into his touch, letting herself believe for just a moment that maybe, possibly, they could make this work. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Volkov." "Dimitri," he corrected softly. "When it's just us, it's Dimitri." From the living room, Ben let out a whoop of joy and began signing so fast his hands were almost a blur. Debbie laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine happiness, and signed back to him. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to try this. We're going to be a family." Dimitri pulled both of them into his arms, and for the first time in longer than Debbie could remember, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The fundraiser was Debbie's idea, a way to raise money for Riverside Elementary's crumbling infrastructure and outdated textbooks. She'd expected maybe 100 people, mostly parents and local business owners. What she got instead was 200 people in formal wear, a string quartet, and enough champagne to float a small boat. Dimitri's doing, obviously. He'd taken her small community event and transformed it into something that made the mayor nervous and the society pages jealous. Debbie stood in a borrowed evening gown, courtesy of Dimitri's insistence that she look the part, feeling completely out of place among the wealthy donors who'd shown up because when Dimitri Volkov invited you to something, you came. "Stop fidgeting," Dimitri murmured in her ear, his hand warm on the small of her back. "You look beautiful." "I look like I'm playing dress-up," Debbie muttered back. "And half these people are here because they're afraid of you, not because they care about inner-city education." "Does it matter why they're here if their money helps your students?" Dimitri countered. "You wanted new textbooks and working computers. Tonight we'll raise enough to renovate the entire school." Debbie couldn't argue with that logic even if the means made her uncomfortable. She'd been learning, over the past 2 months, that dating Dimitri meant accepting compromises, finding the gray areas between her principles and his reality. It wasn't always easy. Some nights she lay awake wondering if she was losing herself, if she was becoming complicit in things she'd never wanted to be part of. But then she'd see Ben's face light up when they spent Sunday afternoons together as a family, or watch Dimitri playing board games with genuine laughter, and she'd remember why she was trying so hard to make this work. "Debbie Morrison?" A woman's voice cut through her thoughts. Debbie turned to find an elegant older woman in pearls and a knowing smile. "I'm Margaret Whitmore. My grandson Derek is in your class." Debbie's stomach dropped. Derek, the bully from the playground. Mrs. Whitmore, it's nice to meet you. I wanted to thank you, Margaret said, surprising Debbie completely. Derek has been a different child since that day you stood up for Ben Volkov. You showed him that real strength isn't about hurting people weaker than you, it's about protecting them. Debbie felt tears prickling at her eyes. Derek's a good kid. He just needed guidance. He needed someone who cared enough to correct him without giving up on him, Margaret corrected gently. Just like you've done for so many of your students. That's why I wrote this. She handed Debbie a check that made Debbie's eyes go wide. For the school. Because teachers like you deserve support, not just words. The evening continued in a blur of handshakes and conversations, donors promising support, and community leaders suddenly interested in Riverside Elementary now that Dimitri Volkov's girlfriend taught there. Debbie hated that part, hated being seen as an extension of Dimitri rather than as herself. But she swallowed her pride because the end result was good, was important, was worth the discomfort. She was standing by the refreshment table, taking a moment to breathe, when she felt it. The sudden shift in the room's energy, the way conversations died and people stepped back, creating a circle of space around someone who'd just entered. Debbie turned and felt her blood run cold. A man in his 50s, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, was walking directly toward her. Two younger men flanked him, their hands conspicuously hidden inside their jackets. "Miss Morrison," the man said, his voice carrying a faint accent. "Eastern European, like Dimitri's. How lovely to finally meet the woman who's captured Dimitri Volkov's heart." Debbie's mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed danger, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm sorry, have we met?" "Not yet," the man said. "I'm Damian Kozlov, an old business associate of Dimitri's. I've been hearing so much about you." Before Debbie could respond, Dimitri appeared at her side, his presence like a shield. But Debbie noticed something she'd never seen before in his face. Fear. Actual, genuine fear. "Damian," Dimitri said, his voice deadly quiet. "You weren't invited." "No?" Damian smiled wider. "I thought this was a community fundraiser, open to all generous donors." He pulled out a checkbook. "I'd like to make a contribution. Say, $100,000? The amount made people around them gasp, but Debbie saw the trap immediately. Accepting money from Damian would tie the school to him, would give him leverage, would make her complicit in whatever war existed between him and Dimitri. "That's very generous," Debbie said carefully, "but we can't accept donations from people we don't know. We have a vetting process for large contributions." Damian's smile turned cold. "How responsible. Though I wonder if you vetted Dimitri's contributions quite so carefully. Or do standards change when you are sleeping with the donor?" The insult hit like a slap. Debbie saw Dimitri's hands clench into fists, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, and knew with absolute certainty that this was about to turn violent. She put her hand on Dimitri's arm, a gentle pressure that said, "Please don't." "Mr. Kozlov," Debbie said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I think it's time for you to leave." "Or what?" Damian challenged. "You'll have your boyfriend remove me? In front of all these witnesses? Think about how that would look in tomorrow's papers. Notorious crime boss attacks rival at school fundraiser. Really help your reputation, wouldn't it?" Debbie felt trapped. Damian was right. Any violence here would reflect badly on Dimitri, would validate every terrible thing people said about him, would probably destroy any chance of him ever walking away from his dangerous life. But letting Damian stay, letting him insult and threaten, felt like weakness. Then Ben appeared, threading through the crowd with the determined look of a child on a mission. He walked right up to Damian Kozlov, looked him straight in the eye, and began signing with deliberate precision. Debbie watched Damian's face change as he realized he couldn't understand what Ben was saying. that this 9-year-old was communicating in a language he didn't speak. "He's saying," Debbie translated softly, her voice carrying in the silent room, "that you should leave his father and his teacher alone. That whatever problems you have with his dad should be between adults, not used to hurt people at a school fundraiser for children. That if you were really strong, really powerful, you wouldn't need to threaten a teacher to make yourself feel important." Ben finished signing and stood there, small and brave and absolutely fearless, staring down a man who probably had more blood on his hands than Debbie wanted to imagine. For a long moment, Damien just looked at Ben. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. "Your son has courage, Dimitri. I respect that." He looked at Debbie. "And you, Miss Morrison, have integrity, which is rare in our world." He turned to leave, then paused. "But understand this. Dimitri is who he is. You can dress him in expensive suits and teach his son to be soft. But it doesn't change what's in his blood. One day, probably soon, you'll have to choose between your principles and your love for him. I hope for your sake, you choose wisely." As Damien and his men left, the fundraiser slowly resumed, conversations restarting in hushed tones. But Debbie stood there, Damien's words echoing in her mind, wondering if he was right, wondering if loving Dimitri meant eventually losing herself. That night after the fundraiser, Dimitri and Debbie discussed Damien's warning about whether people like Dimitri could truly change, with Dimitri admitting he didn't know but had been pulling back from the violent parts of his business, though his enemies wouldn't simply disappear. He asked Debbie to take a leap of faith and stay with him despite the danger, promising to keep choosing her and Ben over his old life, and Debbie agreed to stay, but made him promise that if it came down to choosing between his past and their future together, he would choose them. Dimitri swore on everything he had that he would choose her and Ben every time, and as Debbie leaned against him, she chose to believe that love could be strong enough to pull someone out of darkness, accepting that sometimes faith was simply the choice to keep trying and hoping even when the odds seemed impossible. 6 months later, Debbie received an offer to become principal of Riverside Elementary, but the position's ethics clause prohibited personal relationships with students' families, forcing her to choose between the job and her relationship with Dimitri and Ben. When she showed Dimitri the letter, he insisted she take the promotion, saying she deserved the chance to help hundreds of students instead of just one classroom, and that she would eventually resent them for holding her back from her full potential. Despite Debbie's protests that she'd be throwing away the family they'd built together, Dimitri told her he loved her enough to let her go, refusing to take her dreams away after she'd already sacrificed her safety and peace of mind to be with them. Debbie refused the principal position, choosing to stay with Dimitri and Ben rather than accept a promotion that would force her to end their relationship due to ethics clauses. She told them they were her family and worth more than any career advancement, explaining how they had reminded her why she became a teacher in the first place. Dimitri then revealed he'd been secretly working for months to leave his criminal life behind, systematically transferring businesses and liquidating assets so he could give Ben a normal childhood and build a legitimate future with Debbie. 2 years later, they married in a small ceremony at a community center with Ben as ring bearer, exchanging vows to choose each other daily and prove that people could change and become better than their past, finally becoming the family all three of them wanted. As they walked back down the aisle, Debbie caught sight of their reflection in the community center windows. A former Mafia boss turned legitimate businessman, a teacher who'd risked everything to protect a child who wasn't hers, a boy who'd been invisible to the world until someone chose to see him. They weren't a traditional family, weren't what anyone would have predicted. But they were real, and they were theirs. And they were proof that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose love even when the world tells you it's impossible. Outside, the afternoon sun painted Bridgeport in gold, and for once, the rough edges of the neighborhood looked beautiful. because that's what love did. It didn't erase the hard parts or pretend the danger never existed. It just made you brave enough to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday, that people could change, and that family was something you built through choice and courage and the simple decision to keep showing up, keep trying, keep loving, even when it would be easier to walk away. And sometimes, that was the greatest rebellion of all.